Dun.
Hello.
Hi, Kerri. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. How are you today?
I am well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of
I'm
course.
gonna pass the virtual mic to you. You should be able to share your screen and all that stuff. So the floor is all yours.
Okay. Well, just yell at me if for some reason this doesn't go as planned and you can't see my screen. Just a moment. Let me get it teed up here. All right. I think I'm good to go.
Yes, you are. Go right ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm KerriD from Momentive, and I'm going to spend some time today discussing sourcing sprints. This is an agile approach to how we source here. It's so great and worth talking about with you all today because it enables us to balance ever-changing business priorities while giving us time to make an impact on the work that we're doing. First, a little bit about me. I'm joining you from hot and sunny today. It was raining yesterday. Atlanta Metro, where I work remotely at Momentive. Momentive may not sound familiar to you, but it is formerly known as SurveyMonkey, which many people have heard of. We just did a rebrand, and it's super exciting. I have 2 kids, 2 dogs, 1 husband. Fun fact, my husband and I met serving in the US Coast Guard. So before talent acquisition and before remote work, my first gig was actually on the bridge of a ship, managing navigation and shipboard operations. So fast forward, we've been married 12 years. I've been in talent acquisition for about 8 years. And I like to do fun things with my family, like go boating, go to baseball games, and serve in our community. I've been at Momentive now for nearly 3 years. When I started, we had 1,100 employees, and today we're almost at 1,700. So in other words, we've been busy hiring and sourcing in a highly competitive SaaS market. Currently, I manage a team of sourcers supporting sales and general administrative recruiting. Our agenda for today, I'm going to tell you a story highlighting some challenges we were facing as a sourcing team. Then I'll go ahead and provide some further context so that when I jump in and start unpacking the concepts of sourcing sprints, you can truly walk away with an understanding of how and why they work. All right, let's set the stage by talking about some of the challenges that we were facing as a sourcing team. I'm starting here because my suspicion is that this story will resonate with many of you tuned into this conference. I'm going to actually start with our best practices that we've identified for sourcers. So in general, we like to keep our rec load number low so sourcers truly have the opportunity to focus. We believe that those most likely to actually drive hires thoroughly understand the role they're working on. They craft interesting outreach with multiple touch points, and they effectively engage passive talent. We also like to give the sourcer enough time to successfully accomplish this. Our data shows that when a sourcer spends less than 3 weeks on a given role, there's a very small chance they'll get a candidate through all the way to the offer and hire stage. And that's the ultimate goal, to close the recs. So that said, back to the story, it was very challenging to implement these best practices effectively. There's always a ton of noise coming from the business and on-fire roles emerging on a weekly basis. Fortunately, sourcing has a great brand within Momentive, but as a result of that, there are endless requests coming from hiring managers and recruiting managers for support. I can't tell you how many times I've had the conversation that sounded something like, well, I know you don't have bandwidth for this role, but can you maybe just sprinkle some sourcing support onto it? And of course, when we're already operating in max out mode, I just want to say, nope, sorry. But as someone who recognizes that my relationships with my stakeholders and the business is super important, I got tired and honestly sometimes nervous about having to say no. Sprinkling doesn't work. So sometimes I would say yes. And what would happen is that I ended up assigning a new rec to a sourcer who was already carrying a full rec load. And ultimately, it made the business feel better that someone was on it, when reality was they were already maxed out. And in order for them to effectively work it, they either had to abandon something else or they would hit burnout mode because they were trying to accomplish 60 hours of work in a 40-hour work week, which as a leader, I didn't like either of these options. So this is where sourcing sprint solution comes into play. And for the rest of the time in this presentation, I will walk you through how we solved for these issues and why it works. So before I jump in, there are two things I need to give you context on in order to make this sprint concept comprehensive. First, I should start with, what is a sprint? Admittedly, I'm borrowing this term from software developers that follow Agile methodology. Essentially what it is it's a set period of time in which people complete a specific piece of work. And when it's done, it's done. They immediately jump into the next sprint. Sometimes they work on something different. Sometimes they continue working on what they were doing in a previous sprint. Regardless, there's always a planning phase in the beginning with goal setting, and there's always a conclusion with an output of the highest possible value. There's a ritualistic practice of reviewing the work at the end of the sprint, and it's an intentional pause taken to identify what went well, what could go better. And again, this is just a workflow that occurs continuously over time. The other thing that you should know is that at Momentive, we have both functional and diversity sourcers. Diversity sourcers are awesome. The program is great, but that's an entirely different presentation and they don't use the sprint approach. For the sake of this conversation, I want you to have some context on how our functional sourcers operate, as we call them internally. These are the folks that are assigned to specific recs. Their mandate is to fill the recs faster and with the best talent on the market. They essentially manage the front end of the recruiting process. Again, just wanted to provide you with that context. And so now that you understand the what we do part, I'd like to talk about how we do it. So drum roll, please. Okay, so now that you have the context, let's talk about how these sprints work. The key thing in this sprint method is to define the period of time in which you're working on the prioritized recs. For us, we've found that 3 weeks is a sweet spot. As a sourcer, when you get a new role and you know time's up in 3 weeks, you really have to get in there and make an impact as quickly as you can. After all, that sprint duration might be the only chance you have to work on that role. A few things to call out here. In order to manage this approach, you have to have less recs so you can really dive deep and get in the zone on the ones that you have. You're never actually going to close the rec if you're spread too thin and in the sprinkling mode that I mentioned earlier. It's okay to work less recs in smaller bites because it's very possible that over the course of the quarter, you're working the same amount or even more using the sprint method. So if they're implemented correctly, no one can actually claim that you're doing less work overall. And ultimately, this sets you and your team up for more success. Another thing to call out is that once the allocation is locked in for that 3 week time period and the whole team's rocking and rolling on their assignments, it's super important to limit deviations from the planned approach as much as possible. Now, there's always going to be an appetite from the recruiting and hiring managers to get sourcing support sooner than the next sprint. Unfortunately, this approach provides a framework that as a sourcing manager, I can use to have conversations with my constituents. It helps me to study the pace that work is coming in and getting delegated. Also, there's transparency around the way that we work. So it helps me manage my team's expectations as well as TA partners and hiring managers. And then the last thing that I want to call out here is perhaps to address the question that immediately came to your mind when I said 3 weeks. It's realistic that some roles will require more than 3 weeks of sourcing support, and that's okay. In this model, after one sprint, another one immediately starts. And sometimes we'll roll right into the next sprint with the same job prioritized. Other times we'll work on it, pause, shift the focus onto something else for another 3 weeks, and then come back to it if necessary. What's awesome is that the sprint gives us time and space to make these decisions. All right, so let's go ahead and break down the general workflow that occurs during these 3 weeks. We're always going to start with the planning phase. This is where we set goals around deliverables, and they're typically metric-centric. So for example, my goal is to have 10 screens on the calendar by next week, or a scheduled onsite by week 3, etc. Additionally, within the first few days, the sourcer is either having a kickoff or a calibration meeting with the recruiter. They're gathering the information that they need to build great outreach so they can go ahead and get those teed up. The reason it's so critical that they have this ready to go is because of the concept of end-to-end sourcing. So I want to spend a second here unpacking this for you, because even if you don't run back to work and implement sprints, this is a best practice that you could walk away with and start using immediately. So end-to-end sourcing, I want to paint a picture for you of how you can maximize a 30-minute sourcing block on your calendar. Imagine minutes 1 through 25, you run a search, and you add 6 people to your project. Minutes 26 through 28, you add personalization for each respective candidate, but it's already in a built-in template. Minute 29, you hit send. Minute 30, you're done. So this best practice eliminates the tired old behavior of piling candidates into a project over time. It's not often that 6 candidates in a project would trigger someone's brain to start sending outreach and move on to the next phase. But in this approach, it really is, because we know that soon enough, there's going to be another 30 or 60 or 4-hour block that somebody can do this sourcing. And regardless of the amount of time, like end-to-end is just the way to go. So again, it eliminates behavior of piling up candidates, then building your outreach, then eventually hitting send a week later. And this plays into the ultimate sprint goal of early and continuous delivery over the course of those 3 weeks. The best part is that there should be more time blocks on the sourcer's calendar, because less recs means less meetings. So, and then lastly, at the conclusion of each sprint, the sourcer and their manager will review their work against their goals. They'll celebrate wins, they'll evaluate key takeaways. It's typically a data-rich conversation, and as a manager, it helps me understand how to proceed on this role, what's happening in the market, how I can best support my team, and so on. So lastly, let's talk about why this works. I'll say this out loud. You can go ahead and steal this slide. If this is something you'd like to implement and you need to make a business case, this is what you would take to your manager. I'm going to spend a minute here just emphasizing the behaviors and mindset that the sprint method spurs on. First, it creates an environment where there's transparency of work and collaboration. From the leadership team to the recruiter and the sourcer, everybody's marching to the beat of the same drum. Everyone has all the information they need to drive success, and everyone is aligned to the same strategy and timeline. There is a pattern of sourcing work that's known by and supported by the sourcer's stakeholders. So this enables them in the best of ways to move swiftly and to focus on creating a pipeline that's actually going to close the recs and result in hires. We all know sometimes the hardest part of the job is keeping all the balls in the air, and it limits distractions by steadying the noise coming from the business. It frees up their calendar, and it actually takes some of those balls out of the air. For those that are working on super niche roles, it changes the terrible feeling that they'll linger forever, because now there is an end in sight. Going into the sprint, everyone knows what happens at the end of this sprint. There will be change, and change is okay. Change is good. So we've done what we could, we've done it well, and we've done it with a sense of urgency. And so no one is surprised at the end of the sprint for a need for shifting as new priorities are identified. And that, my friends, is agility. So really the reasons around why it works perpetually goes on. And at Momentive, we feel like we've created something really special with this approach to our work. So now I'm happy to open it up to any questions you may have, and thank you for tuning in. And by the way, can't help myself, I'm hiring. So any questions from anyone, please, they are welcome.
I keep on muting myself and I really hate it every single time. Awesome. So we do have one question, and thank you so much, Kerri. This is a great presentation. So Nicole asked, how do you prioritize the sourcing work?
Sure. So there's a lot of work that comes in, and ultimately there's a number of different factors that we take into consideration as we're prioritizing the work. Sometimes they've been identified by our Horizon team as critical roles, meaning everybody from the C-suite to our VP of Talent Acquisition has called this role out as particularly important for one reason or another. Sometimes it's based on the workload of the recruiter. Sometimes it's based on revenue that's tied to the role. So for example, if it's a role that's needed to really move the business forward from a revenue perspective, it may be prioritized. Sometimes it's a role that has multiple recs attached to it. So let's say they're building a new sales team in EMEA based out of our Amsterdam office, and all of a sudden they open 4 roles. We know that applicants and referrals are likely not going to fill those roles, so that's the case where they would have sourcing support on it so that the team can build up quickly. So again, there's a number of variables that are taken into consideration, but rest assured they're all taken into consideration and weighed against each other to make sure that the work is prioritized equitably and fairly and with the business needs in mind.
Awesome. And then there's one more question. Do you utilize a Kanban project board? I think I said that right.
No, but maybe I should start. I'm not even sure really what that is, to be honest. I'm going to write that down, actually, because I feel like that's a really smart question of somebody who knows what a Kanban project board is.
Because it makes me think it might be like a Trello board type of thing, but it's probably way more high advanced than what Trello can do for sure.
Yep, and admittedly, this is a relatively new method of work that we're taking. We spent more time in the challenge phase than we did in the solution phase, and so I'm definitely still learning how to best manage this method, and so I really do appreciate that question.
Awesome. And we have one more question before we have to go into our next talk. But somebody said, I have seen that in most organizations, the segregation of sourcers and recruiters has not worked, and then go back to the full cycle recruiter role. What could be a top reason for the same is what they asked.
Okay. I'm reading the question too.
Perfect.
Has not worked, and then they go back to the full cycle recruiter role. So the way that I'm reading the question, I apologize if I'm not answering this directly enough. I should say that at Momentive, recruiters and sourcers have what we call like parallel career tracks, where you could have junior recruiters and senior sourcers and vice versa. And really, like, we view this partnership as more of like a triangle trilogy type of relationship between the hire manager, the sourcer, and the recruiter. Sourcers do the front end recruiting for passive candidates. Recruiters manage full cycles still for applicants, referrals, event candidates. As far as providing a great candidate experience, sourcers are always making their candidates aware of the pass off that will occur to the recruiter later on in the process from the very beginning. And the sourcer is welcome to stay involved with the candidate all the way through to close. In fact, I've been asked, like, hey, can you come in and help me close this candidate? I know that the relationship started with you. And so I think part of the reason recruiters and sourcers have such a great working relationship at Momentive is because of that understanding of different subject matter expertise that really complement one another, and just like the open communication and collaboration that occurs when working a specific rec together.
Okay, awesome. So we are out of time, but I know there's one more question. Do you want to answer that question in the chat for Lisa, Kerri, if possible?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Perfect. Okay, awesome. Kerri, thank you so much. I'm going to bring on Trish.
All right.
So let me work my magic.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Put myself and stop sharing here.
Let's see. Remove spotlight. Okay. Trish, you should be on and should be able to see everyone. And here is